I'm going to cut up my vegetables for the Hoppin John. When you cut up celery, slice it into halves or thirds first. I'll show you. Now, do you see that? You want to keep this end intact until you're done cutting your celery. Now, when you're left with this end piece, you can throw it in the trash or put it in the compost, whichever. I'm fixing to make Hoppin John. For Hoppin John, you want crowder peas. These are crowder peas. Don't use black-eyed peas for Hoppin John. That ain't traditional. Black-eyed peas is the Irish version. And the reason we use black-eyed peas for Hoppin John is because Thomas Jefferson grew them on his plantation at Monticello. The slaves used crowder peas. Crowder peas come from Nigeria. Over there, they're called brown peas or honey peas. I prefer the flavor of crowder peas to black-eyed peas any day. And if you want to make this dish traditional, you use crowder peas. I get these canned at my local Super C. I haven't found them at Walmart yet. If you want to, you can buy dried crowder peas from the Camellia brand website or on Amazon. Since I was able to get them canned, I didn't feel the need to buy 4 bags through Amazon. Next thing you're going to need for Hoppin John is smoked hog jowl. That's this stuff. Comes in a package, looks like this. You can use smoked bacon, but I prefer the traditional hog jowl. It has a depth of flavor that bacon doesn't have. The Italians would call this guanciale, but in Italy the hog jowl is only peppered and salted. I don't believe it's smoked. In the South, it's smoked. Another southern alternative to hog jowl is tasso. If you live in Louisiana and you want to make this, use tasso instead of hog jowl. Or you can use hog jowl, that's fine. Y'all do you. Next, you're going to need the Trinity. And if you want to swap out bell peppers for carrots and use classic mirepoix, that's fine too. First thing I'm going to do is cut up this hog jowl. I'm sure y'all have heard that in the South, the slaves only got the cheapest cuts of the hog and the offal and the intestines and whatnot. I'm going to tell y'all something. When it was hog butchering day, before we had refrigeration, and this was even before the ice box, those cuts of meat were delicacies back then. I'm talking in the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, at least up until they got the ice box. And hell, even then you couldn't keep everything in one. They were keeping milk, butter, cream, chickens, and their choicest cuts of meat that you don't generally smoke in those ice boxes. And you had to make sure and swap out that ice every week, sometimes every 3 days, because that dry ice didn't last very long and it had to be replenished. And if you didn't replenish that dry ice in time, everything you had inside of that ice box would go bad. But things didn't really change until the 1950s. And you know why? It wasn't necessarily because of the war. It was because we got all of these vaccines and chemicals. We had penicillin. If our animals got sick, we could give them a shot of penicillin. We started developing vaccines. We got Monsanto that would protect our crops from boll weevils and tobacco mosaic virus. Yeah, a lot of things changed by 1950 because all of these things were developed in the 1940s. So by the 1950s, these experimental things had established themselves and we had come to rely on them. We had refrigeration. We had reliable crops so long as the weather cooperated. We also had farm machinery. Okay? That was the beginning of the International Harvester, was in the 1940s. By 1950, most wealthy farmers had an International Harvester and they could just go to town on those crops. They didn't need manual labor. So it saved us all a lot of money. We could finally afford to eat. A lot of things changed. Don't believe everything you hear. Now, back to that time before refrigeration. Those cuts of hog, the organ meats, the liver, the stomach, the kidneys, the lungs, those things were eaten and they were considered delicacies. They weren't just given to the slaves. White people ate them too. And the chitlins. We use the intestines, what they call hog casing, for sausage. And chitlins was what was left after making sausage. And they weren't just given to blacks or the slaves. White people ate them too. And what about the crackling? That skin. When you butcher a hog, that skin is just delicious when it's fried in its own fat. Things were cooked with lard because in the deep south, they didn't have cattle, so they didn't have butter. We didn't have cattle until after the Civil War. We weren't growing wheat in the United States till after the Civil War either. Any flour that we had in the South was imported from England, and it generally had weevils in it. It wasn't very good to eat, so they made hardtack out of it. And everybody ate hardtack. It wasn't just the Civil War soldiers. Everybody was eating it. Because that was all you could do with that stale, weevil-infested flour. Everybody had it rough back then. It wasn't just the slaves. Don't believe Gone with the Wind and the North and the South. They didn't have it good like that 100% of the time. Okay, this is the skin. The first thing you want to do with hog jowls is remove that tough skin. It's not edible. Don't bother cooking it. Now this here looks like it's mostly fat. I'm going to slice it up just like bacon. If you can see the direction I'm slicing it from, right here, you can see the meat and the fat. It is mostly fat. I'm slicing it about 1/4 inch thick. And when I cook it, that fat is going to render out like bacon. I'll continue on about that hog meat. They had spring houses and wells that would keep that meat cold. Things like pork chops and fresh sausage that have to be kept cold, that you don't smoke, would have to be kept cold in a well or a spring house. And then after they got the ice box, you could keep pork chops and breakfast sausage. But most of the meat on a hog was smoked. Hogs are butchered twice a year. The hogs that were butchered in June were smoked. The hens were smoked and put up in the attic for Christmas. And what do you have left on a hog besides hams, pork chops, and loin, and bacon? Okay? Those 4 cuts of meat. And then, of course, you've got your shoulder roast and your rump roast. The shoulder is what they call the bust and butt. And then you've got the rump roast. Okay? Those big cuts of meat. Then after that, what do you have? The legs, the hocks, the trotters. And we pickle those, called Pickles Pig's Feet. You can find them in the store, or at least you can in the South, because we like them. The jowls, the ears, the snout. Yeah, for real, we eat those too. Every part of the hog can be eaten, except for the bones. And we boil those for stock. If y'all thinking that a plantation master got the best cuts of meat and the slaves got everything else, well, you're kind of right. But those choice cuts of meat would have to be eaten pretty quick so they wouldn't spoil. So anytime a hog was butchered on a plantation, they'd have a party. They'd invite friends and family over to share in their bounty, and they'd be eating pork chops or a roast or a loin. And I think the slaves would get at least 1 ham after it was smoked. That'd be around Christmas time, they'd get a ham. And everything else got smoked. And yeah, they shared it with the slaves. They might not have gotten all of it. I mean, it really depends on how many hogs they butchered. Most plantations really didn't have a whole lot of livestock. Their money was tied up in their slaves. and their land, and they used almost every inch of that land for their commercial crops. It was usually cotton. It was either, if you were in the deep south, it was cotton. If you were in the upper south, it was tobacco. Maryland and North Carolina, where they grew indigo. Everywhere else they were growing tobacco and cotton. Now, the upper south had livestock, but most of the people living in the upper south were white, and they were living up in those mountains. They were Scots who had come here to get away from the Highland Wars. They had just escaped the Highland Wars. The Battle of Culloden brought a lot of them here, and they went up in those mountains. They might have fought during the Revolutionary War, but they didn't want a whole lot to do with the Civil War because they didn't like slavery. Slavery robbed them of jobs that they felt should have gone probably to white people. They had a lot of animosity for the plantation owners. And they didn't especially like blacks either. They didn't need slaves. They had kids and large families to share the load of working on the farm. And they just didn't have any use for slavery. But they were forced to fight in a war for a cause they didn't really believe in. They felt like it was Northern aggression, and they fought to preserve their way of life because they didn't want to have to pay any more taxes. They were tired of the Confederate dollar not being worth as much as the Union dollar. Yeah, there was a lot of reasons they fought. Okay, now I'm going to separate the meat from most of this fat. There is a big fat cap on this jowl. You can see it right here. It's pretty thick, so I'm going to cut that off. There's going to be enough fat to flavor the meat. I'm going to render the fat and save it. You know what they call soul food or slave food is all winter food. It was food that was eaten in the winter in the South. And you don't see very many summer crops because they might have all been eaten by boll weevils or destroyed by the tobacco mosaic virus. You don't see movies about that. Those two things right there caused a lot of famine in the South. And it was causing famine in the South right up until the 1980s. Because it wasn't until then that they had discovered a way to destroy TMV and the boll weevils. Boll weevils are such a problem that we have a state law in Oklahoma that calls for the eradication of boll weevils. That's how bad they were. See, we grow cotton here in Oklahoma too. And my family on my father's side, on my father's mother's side, they owned a cotton plantation in Alabama. They owned slaves. But Captain Handley was an abolitionist slave owner. Captain Handley became a congressman, and he was a signatory to the 14th, 15th, and 16th Amendments. None of us really liked the institution of slavery because white people were chained to blacks as much as blacks were chained to whites. And white people were also chained to the New York banks, and blacks didn't realize it, but they were too. They were owned by the banks. Very few planters actually owned their slaves because they were mortgaged. When McCarthy invented the steel roller gin in 1840, it processed long staple cotton, and it could process up to 200 bales of cotton per day. It revolutionized the cotton industry, but it also made the slave industry worse than what it already was. You see, Eli Whitney's gin was a modification of the cotton gins they had used in India for centuries. And a woman who had inherited an indigo plantation after her husband died paid Eli Whitney to modify the Indian cotton gin so that she could produce more cotton. She wanted to know if it could be done, and she financed the whole thing. See, she only had 50 slaves herself. It was basically an extended slave family. And that's what most of them were. Until 1840, people with these plantations only had an extended family of slaves. They relied on them for survival. The Pilgrims who came here from the Netherlands on the Mayflower in 1620, they had 2 servants with them. Were they white indentured servants or were they black slaves? I don't know if it's documented or not. But I just know they had slaves. That much is documented. And they wouldn't have survived without slaves because our economy was based on manual labor. There were no machines, period. We needed slaves to do our laundry, empty our chamber pots, cook our food, take care of our babies, work our crops, build our homes and our buildings. Hell, they built Wall Street. They built the subway system in New York. They built pretty much all of the buildings there. White people didn't do it. Blacks did it. This country never would have been born if it hadn't been for slaves. All these white people would have died. And it's not because they were white, it's because the caliber of white people who came over here initially were academics. They weren't farmers. They weren't craftsmen. They weren't tradesmen. They weren't carpenters. That's what they needed black people for. And you know what? The Africans from Senegal excelled in carpentry, and that's why they were brought over here. Africans from Nigeria excelled at farming and cultivating crops, and that's why they were brought over here. We purchased millet and sorghum and indigo and rice from Africa, and we needed people who knew how to cultivate these crops. We had to teach them how to cultivate sugar cane because they didn't know how. Sugar cane doesn't grow in Africa. I do believe it was Christopher Columbus who discovered sugar cane, and he brought it back to the Canary Islands and then planted cane on the island of Barbados and Jamaica. But anyway, I'm getting off topic. African slaves were brought here for a reason, And it was their own people who rounded them up. They were kidnapped, abducted by another tribe of Africans who were slave traders. And they were sold to the Spanish first, and then the French, and then later England got involved, and then America, of course. The U.S. imported slaves from the Caribbean islands. That was their involvement in the transatlantic slave trade. In the South, they got mad because they were having to import slaves from the North, so they said, okay, we'll send ships over to Africa ourselves. And they did it out of defiance. And I believe the Clotilde was the last ship to sail up the Mississippi River. And a man by the name of Cujo Lewis, I believe, was the last African who was brought here from Africa. And there was a woman, and I cannot remember her name, because I think the news or some documentary crew did a story on Cujo, and that's why I remember his name. There's a place called Gee's Bend where those African descendants make quilts the same way that their ancestors did. And those quilts are very famous. They're worth a lot of money if you can get one. Slavery was a necessary evil to build America. The problem I have with it was the cruelty and the rape, separating families. I don't feel it was necessary. My ancestor, Captain Handley, he was an abolitionist slave owner, and he didn't believe in the cruelty either. He was one of those who would purchase slaves to save them from a cruel master or a cruel overseer. He bought them as much from the auction block as he did from other slave owners. He always made sure they had new shoes, new clothes, a coat. He was kind to the children. He went against Confederate law and taught them how to read and write in Alabama. And after emancipation, they stayed on the plantation and they voluntarily adopted the Handley name. I was a census enumerator in Lawton in 2000, and I encountered a black woman with my ancestor's last name, and it blew my mind. And I asked her, how did you come by the name of Handley? Because it's a name that, well, with that particular spelling, I've traced it all the way back to 1635 in Virginia. And then she told me the story of how her family had lived on my ancestor's plantation. And I just thought that was really cool, and the fact that she was willing to share that with me is a credit to how far African Americans have come in overcoming the most adverse conditions. And I know we still have a long ways to go. The town I went to school in was a sundown town. And I remember when I was in kindergarten, I was young. We had 2 black girls and a black boy, and we had a quarter Vietnamese girl in my class. And my father who was very old. He was 62 when I was born. He told me not to have anything to do with them because people wouldn't like it. Well, I went against his wishes. I didn't do as I was told. Never have, never will. I became friends with them. And I remember the last lynching that occurred in this town in 1977. Vaguely. That is to say that I heard about it and I knew it happened because I went to school with these girls. One girl, her father was caught with a 16-year-old white girl. They hanged him and burned him. They dragged the other family out of their house. They burned their house and told them to leave town and to never come back. And to this day, that lot is vacant. Nobody will put a house on it. And you know what? When my mother left my father, we moved to a town 20 miles away. And we moved to the black side of this town. We called it another name, but I won't say it on camera. And we were the only white people in that part of town. And I went to an all-black school that was literally just right across the street. There was a Negro Holiness church here, and then our house was here, and then an older black family was over here, and then across the street is this all-black school that I went to. Boy, was I out of place. But anyway, I got along with this older black couple really well. They'd let me come over, and every Sunday they were either cooking fried chicken or fried catfish, and I'd run over there and eat, and they'd share their food with me. They were the nicest people. And it just made me think about how badly these people have been treated in this country and how loving they are. They have a love and a spirit that has defied everything that has been thrown at them. So, slavery is what it is. It's part of our past, but there's been slavery on every continent throughout human history. I think we need to move past the whole slavery issue and the 1619 Project and, affirmative action and all this crap, and just move forward. I remember how well we all got along in the 1980s when Michael Jackson was popular, and we had the Cosby Show and then the spinoff A Different World, and we all got along. So stop it. Leave things alone. Let us overcome our differences and learn how to get along on our own terms. This isn't something you can legislate. The media needs to stop generating hate between the races, because when you strip all that away, we really don't hate each other anymore. That should all be over with. I know there's a lot of pain left over still from the Tulsa Race Massacre / riot in Greenwood. I get it. My father, he knew all about it. He was a Mason and he was a Klansman. Back during the 20s and 30s, the two were the same back then. They really were. And he told me stories. Told me a lot of stories. He told me stories from his parents' time, and he knew his grandparents as well. And he told me stories from the plantation days, from the slavery days, because they lived it. And I'm only 3 generations removed from it, which is also, I think, really cool, because everybody else is maybe 8 or 9 generations removed from it, and I'm only 3 generations removed from it. That's why I'm so well versed in Southern history and slave history. The rest of y'all can be fooled by Hollywood and the NAACP all you want. I'm not fooled by it. I'm cooking the meat part of this hog jowl first. Now I'm going to show y'all this. If you've never cooked hog jowl, they render down just like bacon. Sometimes a package going to call it pork jowl bacon. And the Italians call it guanciale, and they use it just like bacon. Yeah, I think there's a region of Italy that uses guanciale, and there's another region of Italy that uses pancetta. I'd have to look it up to tell the difference. Now I've got all this fat that I'm going to render. And this is what the hog jowl looks like when it's done. See, it's more fat than meat, and that's why I like to cook it before I put it in my peas or any other bean dish I'm using hog jowl in. I always cook it first to get the fat out of it. Okay, now this fat has stopped foaming up and it's starting to turn brown. So just about all the fat is out of it. I'm going to go ahead and cook it a while longer. Now this is what the fat off that hog jowl looks like after I've rendered it. I got plans for that fat. It ain't gonna hurt to put this hog jowl grease in with my bacon grease because this hog jowl was smoked. Now I'm gonna turn the heat back on and I'm gonna saute my vegetables. These cracklings are good, y'all. You don't even know what you're missing. Now I'm going to add some of my Creole seasoning. I'm only adding a teaspoon of it. Now I'm putting in a tablespoon of flour. Okay, my vegetables have cooked down. Now I'm going to add my critter peas and the juice from the can. Now the hog jowl goes in. I ran out of chicken broth cooking Thanksgiving dinner, so I'm having to use vegetable broth. And I'm going to use it first to clean out these cans. Now I'm going to bring this up to a boil and then lower the heat a little bit and let it cook until that bacon jowl gets tender. Hoppin John's done, y'all. There ain't nothing to make in Hoppin John. It's simple. It's nothing but crowder peas, hog jowls, Trinity, and a little bit of flour and Creole seasoning. It's easy. This is so good. And once you've had Hoppin John with crowder peas, you'll never go back to eating black-eyed peas again. I don't even eat black-eyed peas on New Year's. I know it's a tradition of my people in the South, but they can have their black-eyed peas. I'll be eating the traditional crowder peas. I'm going to sit here and finish eating the rest of my crowder peas. I'll see y'all later. Bye.